together discussing. I know as the food bank has been a couple of times in this committee. We've also been in human services and down in government operations. And so all the committee members are familiar with what we're talking about. I'll just start by going over, this is not complicated. You've actually heard the most complicated part of this budget request. Altogether, it's $5 million. None of this is in the governor's budget. So just so you know that off the beginning. And I'll start just at the top here. Seeking total of $5 million, $1.75 million in base funding for responsive readiness. And that's what we had talked about in House Government Operations. I'll explain that a little bit. So over the years, and even before this latest spate of disaster upon disaster, the cumulative disasters, the food bank has always been part of the emergency response system in Vermont. We're not a first responder, but we are part of the state emergency response plan. And we are part of VOAD, which is Volunteer Organizations Active in Disasters. And it's basically an umbrella under which nonprofits and other volunteer organizations come together to coordinate during disasters. And VOAD coordinates with Vermont Emergency Management in the midst of a disaster. So the food bank has always been there. And one of the main ways the food bank supports the state during disasters is, of course, people who are impacted in your districts. When there's a disaster, one of the places that they go to get relief is the local food shelf or meal site. And so, for instance, if there's a flood, people are flooded out of their homes, a lot of people go to the food shelf. And then the food shelf runs out of food and calls us and says, we don't have any food. Can we get another delivery? We often are asked to provide water and ready-to-eat foods for people who lost their cooking facilities or don't have clean drinking water. The Red Cross and to some extent the National Guard does that kind of work also. We tend to be called on to fill in the gaps. A good example is the last round of flooding in Barre, where the Barre Auditorium was the welcome or the ready center. People were gathering there, and the Red Cross hadn't gotten there yet and wasn't going to be there for another 6 hours or so. And there were 100 plus people there and more coming. And so they called us because we're right up the hill and said, do you have any food to send down? That's kind of unofficial, but it happens all the time in different ways. And so what this ask really is a formalization of that role that we already play. We were joking around early and talking about this and saying the food bank's been providing this service to the state for many, many years, kind of like dating. And now we want you to put a ring on it. So we developed this budget, and what this responsive readiness budget would do is allow the food bank at our 3 distribution centers in Barre, Rutland, and Brattleboro to set aside some pallet slots where we would stage bottled water and ready-to-eat meals and the kinds of foods that are usually called upon in disasters. Now, this stuff doesn't sit on the shelf for years. You can't do that. It has to be rotated through stock. So when it starts getting close to its use-by date, we would flow it through our regular system of food shelves and meal sites and then replenish that. It would also allow the food bank to reserve some operational capacity so that we know we would have trucks and, if we have to lease an extra truck or 2, new drivers or driver overtime, just those kinds of incidental expenses, operational expenses that come along with working during natural disasters.
John, sorry to interrupt. I just wondered, in an emergency like, say, the Barre flood, where does the Red Cross get their food from? And do they ever actually turn to the food bag and say, do you have food?
Yeah, the Red Cross has its own national sources. So it would be rare for them to turn to us. If they run out because there were more people than planned, they might ask us if we have some. Also, if the Red Cross is involved, then Vermont Emergency Management has contracts. And so the Red Cross could purchase off of their contract. The challenges in those situations are sometimes there just isn't time. So it can get very confusing, especially in the early days of a disaster. And so sometimes there's some trading, but usually the Red Cross is coming pretty prepared.
Over the years, John, how, I know recently we've had high level, very salient disasters that we all remember. How often over the last 10 or 12 years has the food bank been asked to come and help in the wake of an emergency or a storm or some other event?
Yeah, there's some kind of event usually happens at least once a year. I'm what was it, 2011, which was I had been at the food bank for just a couple of years. We had Irene, and I recall, it was Ludlow or Londonderry, maybe it was Ludlow, where basically the town washed away. There were no road access.
2023.
Yeah.
Both.
Yeah.
North Londonderry. And Ludlow.
Yeah.
Pretty much close.
And so the food bank actually, when they were rebuilding the road, we were the second truck in there once the Corps opened the roads up so that we could replenish, basically set up a mobile food shelf.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, you said that you have a $5 million ask and it's not in the governor's budget.
Right.
So was it in the governor's budget last year? And if not, where did your resources come from to do all the good work that you do?
It was not in the governor's budget last year, although I want to make it clear we have for at least the last 5 years or so, we meet and make an ask of the Secretary of Administration and the Commissioner of Finance to ask to be in the governor's budget.
But it hasn't been.
But it hasn't been put in there.
Okay.
And so the funding to do this work is coming from our donors.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're fundraising and it's coming from our general funds. We also have access to some emergency support through Feeding America, which is our national organization. That takes some time though. So for instance, the 2024 floods, we did reach out to Feeding America because of the length and extent of the damage. And got a couple truckloads of water and a truckload of emergency boxes, but it takes about a week for all that to happen. So it's not a immediate relief.
I don't want to speak for you, and I'll be wrong if I speak for you, but over the past 4 or 5 years, it hasn't been in the governor's budget, but has the budget that ultimately passed had any funding for the food bank?
Yes. So if you look on the back side of the sheet, you can see the green part of the bar is the appropriation. The red line is basically the cost of the level of service that the food bank's been providing. I don't say it's the need because we're not meeting the need. And the purple bar is our philanthropic and operations revenue. So you can see in 2021, 2022, and really somewhat in 2023, a lot of that money was CARES Act and ARPA funding. And so the food bank was working on the federal programs at the food distributions at the airports, and then there were some other morphing federal programs, and we were through the state getting a lot of reimbursement for the costs of providing those services. And then in 2024, the $3 million, Amy may remember this too, but I believe $1 million of that was general funds and $2 million was still ARPA funds. I'll look into that. Yeah. And then in 2025, we were here and asked for $5 million. And it did not make it into the big bill and was added actually in the Senate, and ultimately passed as part of the overflow, the water flow.
So to thinking back to where's the funding come from, if it hasn't come from the state and it's come from donors, but a small in amount has come from the state in the past few years.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we're very grateful for that. Even, every organization comes in is looking for base budget funding, right? But we're all very grateful for one-time funding and, we'll continue to come in and make the case. I should also say there's a small amount, about $84,000 a year that comes and has been in the budget, base budget for 20 years, comes through the Agency of Education to the food bank, earmarked towards supporting transportation. But in a $18.5 million operating budget, that's, it's meaningful, but it's not going to allow us to provide this kind of support. And I should say the responsive readiness funding will go to accomplish something above and beyond what the food bank is already. That's the desire here. We've met with the Vermont Emergency Management. In fact, they've come out to our Barre facility and taken a tour, met with our operations team, and the funding would be a grant through VEM. So we would negotiate a grant agreement or some kind of MOU. So it would be very clear when the food bank would be called on and what functions providing within the context of emergency management. I used to spend a lot of time with those folks, and they like to plan and they like to be prepared. Right? Anything else on that? The second largest part of this ask we've talked about already, which is the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters. And you have H167 on the wall there. I know there's still conversation to be had about that and probably some work on the bill. As I said before, that would go toward purchasing Vermont grown and Vermont raised food and making sure that that's contributing to our Vermont farms and also getting to our Vermont citizens who couldn't otherwise afford that food. The final $1.25 million of the ask would go towards both the operating costs of food distribution, but also mainly grants and support for the food shelves and meal sites in your districts and across the state. So we have about 225 network partners, and those are the food shelves, meal sites, senior centers, out of school programs that get food from the food bank. We have grant programs where we're constantly making grants to our partners. A lot of really nuts and bolts things like, do they need new racking, new shelving? Do they need a new refrigerator or freezer? Is the air conditioning system gone out? And basically, it's a system where they can just, up to a certain level, I think it's about $5,000 now. They can basically fill out a piece of paper and ask for the money and tell us what it's for, and we'll make the grant. There are some larger grants that we make occasionally when there's larger projects and it makes sense for us as the food bank to be engaged.
How does that relationship work with the food shelves then? Is it all donation, say, from the food bank that flows to them, or is it a low cost sometimes?
It's a combination. So we had talked about the different categories of food. We have the federal food, there's donated food, and there's purchased food, and then produce is sometimes a hybrid category. So all federal food is always provided to anyone in the state who's eligible for it with no cost. There's no delivery fees, there's no charge to our partners, and that's in federal statute, and we would do that anyway. Donated food there's no cost for the donated food. It's redistributed. There is a delivery fee of 8 cents a pound. Our partners can also come and pick up at our 3 distribution centers, and there's obviously no delivery fee if you're picking up. And then produce, whether the food bank purchases the produce or it's donated, and we purchase a lot of produce. Last year, I think we've talked about this, it was 2.7 million pounds from Canada, which is a tariff issue. But produce is always distributed at no charge, whether we purchase it or it's donated. So there is the category of purchased foods. We have a co-op program. So staple foods that we can't get enough donated, canned fruits, canned vegetables, canned tuna and chicken, pasta, rice. We'll purchase that by the pallet or by the truckload, and then we'll offer that on a shopping list to our partners, and then we'll deliver it by the case. So there is a cost for that food.
Representative Boston.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, what is included in the $2.7 million of things you buy from Canada? It seems like almost anything you could get from Canada, you could get from us.
Right. It's just the volume we can't get from Vermont.
Okay.
So we buy, and this particular grower in Canada, I know you're familiar with them, Western Harvest. They're a very large operation. We can get basically a mix of all kinds of produce all year round. So we can get, tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers year round from them. They'll provide us with mixed loads. So we get a truck, we get a tractor trailer load every Monday morning, 40,000 pounds of mixed produce. It's hard for us to handle full trailer loads of a single item because frankly, our partners want a variety, and, getting nothing but potatoes or nothing but onions isn't any fun. So anyway, it's the cost. We can have access. We do have access to produce from all over the country, but the transportation cost to get it here, which we have to pay as the food bank. We get some transportation subsidies from Feeding America, but bringing a truckload up from Florida or from Texas or from Georgia is a lot more expensive than coming down from Canada.
It's 50 miles from my house or less.
I was just thinking about what would grow. So it sounds like it's not all things that are grown there.
No, they have a lot of house growing.
Goats and all that.
Yeah.
They have big hot houses too.
Yeah.
They're quite a extensive operation. It's and you get up there, the land is just flat. It's tremendous soils.
Are there tariffs in place at the moment?
There are not. The tariffs were announced and then delayed for a month. So we're waiting to see what's going to happen in a week or two.
Okay.
It would be about an additional $130,000 for the food bank if there were a 25% tariff on the cost of the produce.
The consulate general's downstairs right now.
Yeah.
I went there.
So we've got essentially now three different pieces of this request. Going back to the first one, the first readiness. And I guess this question would apply to any of either of the others as well. If the funding isn't there ultimately to support the full request, would partial amount be useful?
Yes. Yes. Certainly for responsive readiness, we wouldn't be able to dedicate the space and have the amounts of product available that we want, but we would have some. And I think it would make sense for us to go through the process of figuring out how the system would work with Vermont Emergency Management, even for a smaller amount. It would be good for it to be base funding, though, so that, even if it's a smaller amount, so that we can know that we're working on a long-term relationship.
And so this is 1.75 million is a figure calculated based on an expected number of events a year or number of people affected.
And our capacity. Yeah, as an
Existing capacity. You're not talking about adding any more space. Okay.
And as far as the Vermonters Feeding Vermonters funding, we can certainly we can purchase with whatever dollars we have, right? And the more the $2 million is about what we're able to handle and move through our system. Vermont products, because of the volumes we get usually, is a little bit harder to handle. There's more relationships to manage in moving the food around. And then again, the 1.25 million, I think we can certainly work with a lesser amount, but that's what we think would would really support our partners in the field.
Can you talk, John, just about, so this chart that you provided has 6 years, and across the top, there's the red line showing level of service. I think that if you had shown years further to the left in the past, the level of service would have been lower. There wasn't, or at least there wasn't as much demand, say 10 years ago.
I would, that's a tricky question. So, but I would say that we didn't have the capability to do a lot more. We've in the last 5 or 6 years, we've increased our capacity. We rebuilt our Barre facility. Went from 1,000 square feet of freezer cooler space there to 5,000 square feet. We just finished renovating our Rutland facility and added a freezer for the first time and increased our freezer and cooler capacity. So we have more capacity as an organization. And we also have increased every year since I've been at the food bank, we've increased our fundraising, the amount of money we're bringing in. And so it really is a matter of doing the most you can with the dollars that you have. Oh, thank you. These are just right, FY21 and FY21 BAA was about 6 million total in COVID relief funds that came into the food bank. Yeah, you can see that in FY22. That was 1 million in one-time funding. Sorry, I won't try and process this right now.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll use it for questions.
Yeah.
We were a smaller organization and we were providing less service. The reason I say it's a tricky question is because it's hard to know what the actual need is, and it's based on the macroeconomic conditions. What we think happened during COVID was a lot of people came out and got service. They came to the airports and the big food distributions because people were panicked, right? People were very scared. And it wasn't just that they didn't have money to buy food, they were scared to go to the store. And what we saw happen was once folks came out and utilized the systems that were there, they realized that they were helpful and kept coming. And so I would hesitate to say that the demand or the need was less in the earlier years, but we weren't serving as many people.
Senator
Yeah, I think that brings up kind of a fundamental question of, and this isn't to in any way to just belittle or in any way say anything negative about the work of the food bank. It has a huge positive impact on our communities, but similarly, like during COVID, our farm, we received money. I don't even know where it came from, or I was just told about it, through the FSA, and it was like we didn't used to go after essentially free money from FSA, and then all of a sudden there's this chunk that was available because of COVID, and then there have been a couple of other opportunities, and I'm saying to myself, this is just from a business perspective, if I don't go after that money and have that help my baseline, then the next guy that's also selling apples or maple syrup is going after that, and his profit margin is going to be okay, but mine's going to be tight. So it puts, I'm in a situation where I have to factor those calculations in. And I guess it just gets to to what you're saying, that more people are coming because they came during COVID and saw it's a way to help your finances, right?
Right.
So why not? But I guess it's figuring out, like what you're saying, what is a need, what is helpful, and I guess generally speaking, like what is going to make the most resilient community at the end of the day, right? So I kind of think about these things and hearing our different discussions with different, with different agencies and associations. One thing is, I think like developing metrics that address those areas that I see coming up in every single one of our. And I could talk about this as a committee later, but it's something you're bringing up a point and I just want to.
No, I hear you. And really at its core, food insecurity and needing food help is just financial insecurity. And it's always been the case, right? Or not in the way back where you had to grow your own food, but now, I mean, there's plenty of food in the grocery store. It's really just about, do people have the resources to access that food? There are programs and supports out there in certain areas, right? In housing, there's some employment supports, there's education supports. And we just happen to have this system that has developed, I even hesitate to call it a system. There's food available, and it's grown up. So to me, anyone who's showing up needs it. I've been to many food distributions, and I don't think I've ever seen anybody who I thought was just trying to, for instance, increase their profit margin by going to a food distribution, right? It's and this is a national trend that we've seen. After COVID, we had inflation, we had huge increases in housing prices, the reductions in the other supports that we saw around the country from the federal government. And all around the country, there was a huge surge again of folks coming to food distribution. So this is not just a Vermont thing. I think folks are just having a harder time bringing those ends together, those financial ends together at the end of the month. And we happen to have this system of food distribution, which is a support to people. I don't know if you were able to see the film Just Getting By, Bess O'Brien's film. But she interviews a lot of folks who are using the charitable food system. And, a number of them there was one woman I remember who's, she owns her own home. She's retired. Her husband died and she lost his Social Security benefit. And so now she has to go to the food shelf, and she never did before. And I think we're just seeing more of those people who really need this benefit, and were just going without before. And now that they've used it and they see, oh, this works for me, they're continuing to use it. And I applaud them for doing that, for doing what they need to do to be kind of active members of our community, which is really what I want.
Representative O'Brien?
I assume this 5 million isn't like a Goldilocks number. I mean, like you're saying, you're chasing food insecurity. So have you ever sort of extrapolated and say, to get really close to doing away with food insecurity in Vermont,
Sure.
what would that number look like?
Yes, we actually did that study with our national partner, Feeding America, a couple of years ago. And I believe this is what we call the meal gap. So based on surveys with people, the amount of dollars they would need to feel food secure, right? To feed themselves and their families with adequate nutrition. And it was about $80 million a year. So that number may be a little bit bigger or smaller. And it was consistent. There was a study done in Massachusetts too, based on kind of per capita. It was consistent. Their number was much bigger, obviously. They had a lot more people. But I think that's roughly in the range of if I were to, let's say if we were to have a state variation of 3 Squares Vermont, or add on to those benefits, if we did another $80 million a year, got the right people, then we could have a food secure Vermont. And I'd also point out the food banks work. We recognize that we are a Band-Aid, right? And the food security roadmap is the plan to bring Vermont to a place where the food bank's going to be will never totally go away, right? There's always going to be a need, but a much smaller organization. And This is necessary right now because we haven't gotten to the end of the road yet, but we will get to the end.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, what I like about. Hate to say that, what I like about this program. What I like about the services you provide is you're providing food and not. You're providing nutritious, helpful, healthy food is what I want to say. Correctly. And that's what I like about the program and your, you know, you're working with farmers to get food out and it's wholesome, healthy food, whether it's organic or conventionally grown, but it's the raw foods. It's not processed food. I'm sure some of the stuff you get in boxes ready to go is probably more processed, but
It is, and I'll say we get a lot of donated food and we take what we can get and we do redistribute everything. When we're sourcing food, when we're purchasing food, whether it's local food from Vermont or Canadian produce or, shelf stable food, we're always looking for the most nourishing. So if we buy canned fruit, for instance, we always buy it in natural juices and not in heavy syrup. When we're buying pasta and rice, it's brown rice and whole wheat pasta. So we want to make sure that we're giving people the choices of food that's going to nourish them.
and if it's donated food, every now and then a box of crap macaroni and cheese. Just
But we do a lot of macaroni and cheese. We do a lot of macaroni and cheese. It's very high demand.
fun to eat food.
Fun to eat
You should
food.
have some of that too.
John, the bill specifically, H-167, is the food bank wanting to weigh in on anything in the bill that goes beyond the request that's embedded in the bill?
I sat through Mike's testimony and there were some interesting nuances. I think the one thing that we've talked about internally is if it would be easier to think of this or work better from a legal point of view, to think of this as a farm subsidy, then that's okay. I mean, really, it's the end result of local produce and local grown and food in Vermont getting to the food bank and being able to be distributed through our distribution network is what really matters.
Mike, I know, had wanted to check with another resource, and I believe he did after that conversation, and he felt a little more comfortable with any constitutional issues that might have come up because of the way that it's currently worded. I'm not sure that completely answers the question, but as far as the food bank is concerned, you're a little flexible on it, and that could also go with it the way it is. It would work for you as far as.
That's right. I know there was some conversation also about, what's a small farm. Some of that stuff, there's definitely room to be more flexible. It's really, we use that term, and it's not a term of art for us. It doesn't mean anything. It means that for us, farms that are not going to be able to deliver us pallet quantities or Gaylord quantities on trucks, we prefer that they work directly with our partners. And so we call them the small farms.
I think we discussed that the other day.
Yeah. And I think there are easy fixes to bring whatever clarity is helpful to the bill. And we can work around that as an organization. I think the key is to be able for the food bank to directly purchase and redistribute, and then also to be able to make grants to our partners to be able to directly purchase from Vermont farms.
Any other questions for John? Okay. All right, thank you then.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So we do not have at the moment the Agency of Agriculture on the agenda this week to come in. And we may try and, I'm not sure if they're available, but we may try and do a little rearranging so that they can come in and speak to this bill and the miscellaneous ag bill of the Agency of Agriculture. And maybe some of the other bills up there too, I'm not sure. So that's something I think we need to do if we're gonna move ahead with either of those two. And then we have invited DCF to come in also, and I think they're scheduled for tomorrow afternoon to talk more about some of the data that might be available. Okay, good. I think if we've got another witness coming in a couple of minutes, so maybe we'll take a little break and be back at 10.
Okay.
Good.